Hey friend, in today's watercolor tutorial, I'm going to be teaching how to paint this winter storm landscape. Without further ado, let's get painting. For today's tutorial, I'm going to be using VanDyke Brown, Payne's Gray, Hooker's Green, and Black. I'm also going to be using some sea salt as well. And I have my size 6, size 2 round Princeton brush, a sponge brush, and I'll also be using some white gouache as well as I drop it to add some snowy details on one of our pine trees. And the paper I have here is a size 5 by 7 inches. To get started, I'm going to use my sponge brush to fully saturate the page about 2/3 of the way down. And just to sketch the area of where I'm just going to take some Payne's Gray and I'm adding my wash to about this point. So I'm going to go ahead and take some water and just incorporate water all throughout the page here. Just getting a nice saturated even layer of water. Okay, so I'm going to take some Payne's Gray and just slowly build up kind of a stormy sky here. So I'm going to start with this left corner and just drag down some of the pigment of the Payne's Gray, and I want to leave a few highlights of white areas as well. I'm going to do a little bit in this right corner too. And then just a hair bit of a lighter value of Payne's Gray in the center area here. And I'm just going to go ahead and drag down some of that wash value of the pigment. So it's a very loose, watery sky. And I want to note, I have used sea salt with the professional grade Winsor & Newton to get snowflakes in the sky. And I've also tried to use it with the Cotman line of Winsor & Newton. And for some reason, when I use the Cotman line, the sea salt doesn't really bloom as much as compared to with the professional grade. Side note, I'm just layering a second layer of Payne's Gray in the top right and left corners. So going back to the sea salt thing, if for some reason your sea salt is not really blooming in the pigment as we get going, you can always use white gouache to just manually add in snowflakes with a tip of a size 2 brush, and that works perfectly fine. So I just wanted to share that before we incorporate our sea salt. I'm gonna add just a little bit of depth over here as well. Again, this is just super simple and loose. Okay, so at this point, I want to take just a small pinch of sea salt. A little goes a very long way, I have learned. So I'm just incorporating our first bit of sea salt, mainly in the sky. So the top third. Okay. And at first they don't quite bloom. It takes about 10 minutes for it to kind of work its magic. But in the meantime, I want to get started on our ground here. And it's okay if some of the pale wash of the Payne's Gray bleeds down below. I'm just going to start by incorporating just a little bit of water with whatever remaining Payne's gray is left on my brush. And then from here, I am just going to do a really simple kind of dry brush technique, just allowing some flecks of white to pop through. And then I also want to mix up just a little bit of black with some Payne's gray. And I'm using a very light tone of this mixture, so not very dark, a really washed out version of it. And then I'm just gonna do some streaks pointing towards the left corner of the page. And I'm using the side of my brush to get this kind of dry brush texture in some places. And right around here, we're gonna have a shadow where we're gonna place a large pine tree. So I'm gonna add just a couple layers of this Payne's gray and black wash in this region for some shading. Okay, so that's just super duper loose. And then I am just gonna gauge out our pine trees here. I feel like the page has kind of absorbed the paint enough to get started on our Misty pine trees here. We do want it to be slightly damp, but we don't want it to be sopping, pooling wet. So I'm just gonna kind of gauge here using some black and some Payne's gray, but this time doing kind of a larger mixture, or sorry, a darker value. Not so much of a like a wash value as we just did here. All right, and once that's mixed, I am going to take my size 2 brush and I want to start to incorporate some pine trees. So I like to start with a line, just a vertical line, and then loosely just take my brush back and forth and kind of mimic a cone shape, but with some rough edges on either side. And the top is nice and pointed and elongated, and the thinnest point of the tree, and the bottom gradually gets wider. And if needed, you can layer a second layer of the color just to make it pop as it kind of bleeds out just a little bit. Okay, so there's our first tree. Now I want to do a second one, and maybe it's just kind of medium size in length, so slightly shorter. And again, I'm just going to mimic that loose cone shape. Then I just want to elongate the top just a little bit to be slightly pointed. So I'm just tapping my size 2 brush. Do the same thing on this left tree here. Okay, and then I want to do a slightly shorter tree here. So starting with that little vertical line and then just widening it at the base. And then I'm just going to layer up just a little bit more paint just to darken it slightly. Okay, and then I want to say 2 more trees. So I'm going to do one that's slightly taller. There's our vertical line. And then I'm just going to incorporate that texture on either side, mimicking that cone shape, just like we have been before. right, and now I'm just gonna finish off with 2 more trees that are smaller off towards the right. All right, and before we move on with anything else, I'm just gonna take a few grains of sea salt and add them over the tree area. And just adding a few granules of the sea salt, not going too crazy. Okay. And now I'm gonna take my size 6 brush and I just wanna kind of buff out this water line with some plain water, just to help smooth out that transition a bit. Okay, and now at this point, I wanna add a few branches down below, and I'm gonna use my size 6 brush, and I'm gonna mix up some VanDyke Brown with a touch of black. So a nice deep brown, and I'm going to just do a few kind of like Y letter shapes, just different angles of branches here, not overthinking it too much. These are just bushes that have lost their foliage in the winter season. And before I do some bushes here, I kind of want some of them to kind of bleed out and bloom below. So I'm gonna add just a wash of water, just in this like 1/2 inch right here. And then I want to incorporate just a few jagged lines, nice and angular and loose. I'm just allowing that end to kind of bleed down a little bit for some wet and wet. And then lastly, I'm gonna do just a little bit of a bush over here that's slightly partially in view. And again, I'm just connecting angled lines off of a base stem, kind of mimicking the letter Y, just at different angles stemming off. And some branches can overlap. Okay, now I want to just make sure this water line is going to not create kind of a bloom that, you know, what's that word called? It's not a bloom, but it's basically where you get kind of like this. What's happening here, it's kind of like that. But I'm just smoothing this area out with my size 6 brush that's dry, just kind of buffing it out a little bit. Okay, and before we move on, I just want to take my size 6 brush and just incorporate a little bit more definition in our trees. So I'm going to add a point to them. And my page is still wet at this point slightly, and so yours may or may not be. So this part is optional. But if your trees kind of overbloom like mine did, which is easy to do with wet and wet technique, after a couple minutes like we've waited here, I'm just able to add a little bit more definition to the trees at this point. Okay, now I'm just gonna let the rest of my page dry, and when we come back, we're gonna finish off with a nice snow-covered tree towards the right. All right, now that our painting has dried more, I wanna mix up some Hooker's Green with some of our VanDyke Brown, just to make it a little bit of an earthier tone. And then I'm also gonna mix some Payne's Gray up with that green and VanDyke Brown. So we want a very earthy, neutral, kind of subtle green. It's more like a blue green. And in fact, I am just gonna color swatch it real quick. Perfect, so it's a very like neutral green. I'll water it down just so you could see when it's watered down. It's like almost like a deep sage green, but because we're going to use a more concentrated color, it'll appear quite dark. So to get started, I'm going to use my size 6 brush, and I want to start actually from the top, and I'm just going to do these almost wispy like dash mark brush strokes, like little eyelashes, and just layering them really loosely, so just a nice even texture here. And then as we increase down from here, I want to kind of elongate and widen some of our brush strokes. So I'm going to start with kind of a almost like a sideways letter Y here, and on either side I'm just going to fill this kind of branch here with some texture using my brush, just tapping on either side, adding some kind of like eyelash brush strokes on either side as well. And I am just going to increase the length of the boughs of the branches, and again just kind of adding another Y shape, and then just adding that kind of eyelash texture on the top and the bottom side of the branches. Really loosely layering these and then allowing some white to pop through in the background. Again, I'm just carrying that technique, but just increasing the length of our branches. And then as I get towards the bottom, I'm going to angle the branches slightly more downward, like they're sloping down slightly. So I'm just adding a couple branches, very loose, and then just doing that kind of tapping eyelash texture on the bottom and top side. I'm just gonna elongate a few branches just to kind of stand out a little bit. And just so it's not a perfect cone shape, there's some irregular kind of organic quality to it, extending some of those branches out. And then at the bottom, I want to add a little bit more shading. So I'm just going to use our Payne's Gray and Black blend here. And just use my dry brush technique of using the side of my brush and just incorporating some shading here. Just kind of sliding my brush across. And then I'm just going to buff out these areas with a watered down brush. Okay, and now I want to use my size 2 brush to incorporate some snowflakes in the sky. We do have our sea salt, and my sea salt kind of bloomed quite large. Maybe my page was just a little bit too wet. So noted, sometimes it's good to wait just till it's slightly damp to add it, but that's okay. I still am happy with it regardless. But I just want to add a few dots of white kind of falling here. Just using the tip of my size 2 brush and really light pressure with my hand, so that way the dots are nice and dainty and delicate. And again, I'm just placing them very irregularly. Okay, and then I'm just gonna add a couple, just a few in the sky. Okay, and now I want to go ahead and add some snow to our larger tree using our white gouache. I just want to add some texture to kind of the top areas of the branches. And again, I'm just lightly tapping very loosely and irregularly on the top areas, still allowing the green to pop through here and there. Don't want to overdo it too much. But I'm just kind of layering up some of that white gouache on top. It's easy to go overboard with the snow on the tree, so definitely make sure to have some green still popping through. It's nice to add just a little bit of snow on top of the larger extended branches. Thank you so much for joining me for today's watercolor tutorial. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any further watercolor tutorials.